Hi guys, Callum from the Bushcraft Cave here, and welcome to another video. It's a lovely day in August, and we've got a really interesting topic that I hope you're going to enjoy. We're going to be talking about carbon steel versus stainless steel. Now, this is subject to a lot of controversy online, and I've been witness to a few pretty heated debates around the campfire in the evening of which is the better knife steel. And the answer is, it really depends. There are lots and lots of variables, such as the materials used, the quality of the materials used, the percentages of those materials used in the composition, the heat treatment process, the environment you're going to, the activities you're going to be undertaking. Now, there's lots of variables, so we're just going to be basing this video on generalizations. But by the end of this video, you should have a pretty good idea of which will be the most appropriate knife steel, depending on the environment you're going to and the task you're going to be undertaking. We're going to start with each knife in turn. We're going to begin with carbon steel. We'll talk about the composition, the pros and cons. We'll do exactly the same with stainless steel, and at the very end we'll have a quick summary. I'm also going to dispel a common myth over using carbon steel and fire steels at the very end. Let's start with carbon steel. Composition: 98% iron, 2% carbon. A popular type of carbon steel is 1095. Composition of that: 99% iron, 1% carbon. And for those of you thinking, well, what's the point in adding any carbon? Why not make the knife 100% out of iron? The answer is that iron on its own is simply too soft. Carbon's used to add strength and toughness. So let's talk about some of the pros of a carbon steel knife. This is a Opinel number 8 that I've got in my hand here. This is one of my favourite knives for skinning. Now, normally when it comes to butchery, you would generally be using a stainless steel knife for reasons we'll discuss in a moment, but I just prefer the Opinel. I like the really skinny the blade on it. I like that there's no bevel whatsoever. It's just a really good knife to really get in there, and it's very easy to clean off afterwards. Now, the pros of using a carbon steel knife are, and again, we're basing this on generalizations because of all the variables, but generally speaking, a carbon steel knife is easier to sharpen than a stainless steel knife. Some of you may argue that that lies in the skill of whoever's sharpening the knife, and to some extent that is true, but factually speaking, based on the composition, carbon steel is actually an easier knife to sharpen. Not only is it an easier knife to sharpen, but generally speaking again, you'll be able to retain the edge for longer. So for general campcraft / bushcraft tasks, daily tasks, a carbon steel knife is ideal. It's very good for battening wood, removing bark, for skewers, creating bow drill sets, any of the general day-to-day tasks that you would need a knife for. Things like cutting plant fibres, or cutting paracord or jute twine, whatever it may be. So you may ask yourself, well, if it stays sharper for longer and it's easier to sharpen, what's the downside? And the downside is, because of the very high percentage of iron in it, if the knife comes into contact with any moisture, it will begin to oxidize, which is rust, and on the outside of your knife you'll see lots of iron oxide. And I've got a good example of that here. This is an old Mora knife of mine which has been very mistreated over the years, and hopefully you can see that okay, but the knife is absolutely covered in rust on the outside, and that's just because I've left it in damp environment and I haven't looked after it. Now, that's not to say I can't restore it to its former glory with a bit of work, but if mistreated, this is what will happen to your knife. So the downside is it's quite maintenance heavy. Every evening the knife will need to be cleaned, and it will need to be protected with some form of oil. Now, speaking of oils, that's almost a video in itself for another time, but for the purpose of this, when using an oil, if your knife is going to be coming into contact with food, well, I would obviously recommend a food grade oil, something like olive oil, or even something like beeswax, which we've done an article about very recently. This is my knife, my general bushcraft knife that I use. This is a Mora Bushcraft Black. Many of you will be familiar with this one, and the reason why I'm mentioning it is because manufacturers of carbon steel know that there are problems with rust. So what they do these days is, some of them, they coat the outside of the knife in an epoxy glue, which definitely does help prevent against the rust. Some argue that it just means the manufacturers can be lazy and don't need to worry about the finish, and to some extent that is true, but generally speaking it's just to protect the knife from forming any rust, and it does a good job of that. The reason why I mention it though is because you have to be careful when using this knife in conjunction with food, because not that I've read anything set in stone, but I have heard reports of small parts of the epoxy may come off in your food and it's not very good for you. Some argue that it causes cancer, but these days virtually everything does. So that is carbon steel complete, and now we'll get a stainless steel knife out and we'll go through that in just a second. So on to stainless steel now. Composition between 70 and 88% iron and 30 and 12% chromium. To be considered stainless steel, a knife must contain at least 12% chromium. And it's the chromium that not only makes the knife very reflective and shiny, but it also gives it its anti-corrosive properties. We spoke about carbon a second ago and how that will rust when moisture forms on it. When it's left in a moist and damp environment, and rust will form on it. But stainless steel can be left in those sort of environments, and it will take a very long time before you'll start seeing the effects of that. It's not to say it can't happen, and even when it does, it's only very minor in its surface rust, which can just be wiped off very, very easily. So if you go into environments where you know it's going to be very wet, or you're going to be on the coast or the sea, or you're going to be doing a lot of field butchery, if you go to any professional kitchen, you'll generally only ever see stainless steel knives. That's why, and this would be by far the better choice. Now, when it comes to survival situations, for anyone who's a prepper looking at and watching this video, the stainless steel again might actually be a good option because of the chromium, and it makes it very reflective. Hopefully you can see that with the sun. It actually makes a great signal mirror, and it could be used to signal an aircraft or a boat or something else. On the flip side of that, a bit of a con is, well, you know, if you're in an environment and you're trying to go, you're hunting for example, well, the wildlife are going to spot that a million miles away and they will run a million miles. So it's got its pros and cons, but for a survival knife generally people do opt for stainless. We also spoke earlier about carbon steel being an easier knife to sharpen. Now stainless steel can achieve a razor's edge, and it just takes more practice. It just takes a little bit of effort. If you've got a field sharpening stone such as a DC4, which is the one I would recommend by far over anything else for the price, it just takes a bit more work, but you still can achieve that edge. And there's also an argument to say that, well, if you know that you're not going to be putting your knife through a lot of abuse and you're not going to need to sharpen it often, well, again, a stainless steel knife is perfectly acceptable. Now, nowadays there are some manufacturers such as SE, Mora, Opinel, and many, many more who make excellent stainless steel knives which do have a very, very good edge retention, just as good as any carbon steel. So as I said at the very beginning, we are basing this video on some generalizations, but to summarize, for a general bushcraft knife, I always opt for carbon. That's my favorite and my go-to. I actually don't even own any stainless steel knives. This is a friend of mine. They're not for me, and they're not for a lot of people. If you haven't got a black epoxy coating on your knife, there actually forms a nice patina over time on the knife, and it just adds to the character. But if you're going to a dry environment and you need a hard wearing knife to perform daily camp tasks, carbon steel, hands down, every time for me is a better choice. If you're going to an environment where it's going to be very wet, or it's going to be raining, like the Peak District or the coast, or just when the weather's particularly bad, or you're going to be doing field butchery, well, stainless steel will be an obvious choice to take with you. Not to say carbon steel can't carry out those tasks, it's just, as we spoke about, you just need to be aware about the maintenance at the end of every evening. And again, for me, that's what I like. I like sitting down around the campfire in the evening and cleaning my tools and preparing them, and if I've been field dressing any game, I like sterilising it with water, resharpening it, and then coating it and putting it back in. It's just part of being outside and those general daily tasks. But in those types of environments, a stainless steel knife would be better. So I hope that given you a better understanding of the two knives and the materials used, and why carbon is better than stainless in some situations and stainless is better than carbon in other situations. The last thing I just want to touch on is regarding carbon steels and fire steels. So this is just a little extra thing we're going to throw in at the end here. So I read online from time to time people talking about only being able to use carbon steel to produce sparks with a fire steel. Now, I think the confusing part is the terminology people are using. For me, this is a fire steel. This is a traditional fire steel we covered in our other video. This is made of carbon steel. So again, roughly 98% iron and 2% carbon. This is a Light My Fire 2.0 Army. This is what's called a ferro-cerium rod. It's the modern day brother of the fire steel. It consists of ferro, which is iron, cerium, magnesium, and a few different other metals. This is what can produce white hot sparks. Now, when it comes to a ferrocerium rod, yes, you can use the back of a carbon steel blade. Yes, you can use the back of a stainless steel blade. This is a piece of flint, which can be used with a ferrocerium rod. I've even seen people use glass with it. So when you're talking about a ferrocerium rod, you can use virtually anything that's hard enough to create sparks with this. This is a traditional fire steel. To create sparks with this, again, it can only be produced from items that will scrape small particles of the steel off. So, for example, as in our previous video, we've got some flint here, and this can be used in conjunction with the fire steel. The flint will shave small particles of the steel off, they'll oxidize in the air and create small red sparks. You can use quartz and other types of stone, anything hard enough to shave small particles off the fire steel. This is a carbon steel knife. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on, this is carbon steel and this is carbon steel, so this can produce sparks, so can this produce sparks? And the simple answer is, yes it can. Due to the heat treatment processes on carbon steel, which again vary hugely, although you will be able to produce sparks, again, with something like a piece of quartz or a piece of flint or anything else that's hard enough, it will be very difficult to start a fire with a carbon steel knife. The sparks you're going to get are going to be very, very weak, even weaker and more sparse than using a fire steel. So unless you've got something like a piece of char cloth with you, you will find it very, very difficult to use a carbon steel knife to produce enough sparks to get a fire going. So I hope that clears any confusion up over that matter. And once again, thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have, please like and subscribe to the channel for some more content that will be coming in the next few weeks. Also, all our social media is down at the bottom there. And as usual, if you have any questions, queries, comments, or anything else you'd like to add, please feel very, very welcome to leave a comment, and we'll see you on the next video. Thank you.